About, 19 years later, towards the late 1690s, he was found married and had produced his first child, a girl by the name of Mary. We find her marrying a man by the name of Thomas Dove round about 1719, and by 1722 she was home with Michael, with her husband, had produced a son, James, in the March the 13th in fact, and by March the 26th she herself was dead of puerperal fever. Thomas stayed on with Micah, with James, the little boy, until about 5 years later when he got married. His new wife didn't want to know about the child, so James was left with Michael and his uncles and aunts, and Thomas left a small sum of money for the child to be brought up. As far as we know, that was it. That was the end of the contact. 1736, when James was 14 years old, it was a lovely sunny June morning. Two figures were seen walking across the fields at Sullens towards some woods. The larger of the two was carrying what appeared to be panniers over his shoulder. About an hour later, the taller figure returned, minus the smaller. It appeared to be covered in blood, and it was Michael, in fact, and he tried his utmost to get rid of his blood-stained clothing. The legend has it that, in fact, he tried to burn it and burnt the house down in the process, and hence the local name of Burnt House Lane. That is not correct at all. A hue and cry was raised at the cost of 6 shillings and sixpence. Sixpence to cry Michael and 6 shillings to try and find James. Michael, in fact, ran away. He hid for about a week in, it is thought, a chalk pit, which is just below us. There was a cave there. Certainly the remnants were there in my youth. After about a week he returned. He was duly caught, more or less arrested, and put in the custody of his son Richard. James's body at that point had not been recovered. Nobody knew what had happened, and Michael so certainly was not saying anything at all. He ran away again, only for a short period of time, and this time he was actually caught, and in the August we find him being taken over to Winchester Jail to languish in there until his trial. It wasn't until the October, which I find really very odd, that James's body was discovered. Now, when I say his body was discovered, in fact it was only the bits of it. A man finally found the wood and found the secret hiding place where the panniers had been. He emptied the panniers out, which were absolutely stinking at that point, and out rolled a head, some tattered clothing, some bits of body, a pair of shoes, and a seething mass of maggots. Michael had actually chopped his grandson up. We have no idea why. We know it must have been premeditated because he went with a billhook and that was found near the panniers. So he must have gone with the intention of killing his grandchild, but why? They couldn't have been for money, because by that time the small portion of money that had been left for his upkeep had gone. Legend has it that James had upset him by not having his meals on the table in time, but then surely he would have upped and hit the child there and then, rather than take him into the woods to kill him. Michael was summarily brought to court one Saturday morning in March of 1737. He was found guilty. He never defended himself in any way whatsoever. In fact, he seemed, if anything, totally confused and bemused about the whole thing. So we still don't know why he did it. He was left hanging there for a short while. His body was then covered in tar and pitch. It was put in a supportive cage and it was brought back here and exhibited on the gibbet that stood here. And the local children used to say, "Michael Morey is now dead for cutting off his grandson's head. Here he hangs on Arraton Down for rooks and ravens to pet down." And that's precisely what they did. The air was black with rooks and ravens as they tore the rotting remains of Michael Morey from the cage. It actually got to the stage where, in fact, it was so noisome that all the local people said, "Look, enough is enough. Let's take the remains down now." So the body was cut down, and as far as anyone is aware, it was buried somewhere in this area, but nobody knows precisely where. And there you have the story of Michael Morey's hump, and I think you'll agree with me that it was pretty gruesome. Now we have walked about halfway down a lane which is commonly known as Shepherd's Lane, but I much prefer to call it Dowsabel's Lane. She was a lady of Hazley Manor who was a very beautiful creature, very flighty, much liked on the island. Dowsabel took up with Lord Edward Horsey, who was the captain of the Isle of Wight. He'd got a poor little wife tucked nicely away in France, and so he and Dowsabel became very much an item. In fact, they were well known, the pair of them, for their parties. She was known as the best housekeeper on the Isle of Wight, and they were famed throughout the island for their entertaining. A meal that they would hold perhaps once or twice a week, quite regularly, would consist of 2 beeves, i.e. 2 big cows or oxen, 8 sheep, and then of course all the chickens and geese and other delicacies that they put on the table. But Dowsabel's party piece at the end of every feast was to get her piper to pipe her, and she would dance from Hazley Manor up this lane to the foot of the down and back again, and that was Dowsabel's party piece, hence the reason I call it Dowsabel's Lane. It is said that this pub is about 400 years old, so it would have been built towards the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, and was a staging house. Probably involved, if the truth is known, like so many of the pubs were, with the smuggling round here. However, I have discovered, ferreting around in all the books that I've got at home, that there is a record in the Core Abbey charters and grants and deeds which shows that in 1484 the then Abbot of Core negotiated with 2 of the church wardens of Arraton by the name of Chessel and Granger to lease a piece of land which they had to build a comparable dwelling within 3 years. And the portion of land meets almost precisely the outline of the current pub. So, was that piece of land, or the building thereon, the original church house where they produced the church beers? It would seem possible or feasible, as 2 church wardens were involved in the deal, or we don't know how it was used for any other means, but the record does appear to go back to about 1484. It's difficult to understand with the volume of traffic that goes past the pub that in fact up until only a little over 100 years ago this was just an unmade track, barely passable in fact by horse and cart. The Highways Act for the Isle of Wight was passed in 1813, and McAdam of Tar McAdam fame came over in 1821 and said how disgusted he was with the state of the island roads. I think perhaps there's an awful lot of island motorists would probably agree with him and say that the state is an awful lot better now. And here we are 100 years on. Well, sadly, this is actually the end of this particular series. I do hope that you've enjoyed coming on the walks with me and hearing some of the stories and the history that I've had to tell you, and that for those of you who may not live on the island, it might encourage you or titillate your appetites to come over and visit our beautiful island. So until the next time, from my friends that have been with me, Harry, Tony, Vicky, Marion, Elizabeth isn't with us, may I all wish you all a very fond farewell and goodbye.